Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be, I hope, very interesting today. We've got Joel Kotkin. Joel serves as the presidential fellow in urban futures at Chapman University and is a senior research fellow at Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. Now, uh, Joel, you're originally from New York, is that right? I mean, I can't tell, because you sound so Midwest, but go ahead.
Uh,
Give us your story.
No, but basically, I moved to California in 71. I went to Berkeley. I moved down to Los Angeles in 75, lived in LA for 40 years. And then when we finally realized that we would have to send our youngest daughter to private school after fifth grade, we decided we would move to a place where we could go to public school, and she did. And we moved.
And so you have been, what are you a kind of a philosopher, a studier of humanity? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
I'm basically a writer. I'm not a specialist. I don't think of myself as, even people call you being a demographer or a political scientist or even historian. Historian, I would probably prefer to the other ones. I studied history. My background in school was classical history. I had 6 years of Latin. Um, I have a great interest in history. I just came back from a month in Rome, so which was like a favorite playground for me.
Now, Joel, so what sparked our interest, of course, is this discussion about the looks like the growing strength of religion, or some would call it a revival. You've written about this. Are we experiencing, in your judgment, some sort of a religious revival?
Well, I did this study with my friend Becky Balobo, who's from South Africa, and certainly in Africa, it's there's a huge surge, particularly of Christianity. Um, but what we really found, which was most interesting, whether it
Why
was
is that, Joel?
why
Why is it surging in South Africa?
Well, because I think people are looking for and this really fits into the wider discussion, is it's a efficacious way of living your life. Other words, it really it people, for instance, in Nigeria who are Christians simply do better than Muslims and animists. They just do. Um, so what I think we're finding is in Africa, but also in the United States, that the people who are attracted to religion, I don't think their percentages are growing so much as the type of person who's becoming religious. We always had this thesis, well, the people who were religious, well, they didn't know any better and they were poorly educated. And, once they became educated, they'd be enlightened and then they wouldn't be religious. But what we're finding in the data is that actually religious people tend to do better. People from poor backgrounds, if they're religious, the chances of them doing better are much greater. And it's hugely supportive of the family, of intact families, um, and about providing values in a society that is pretty nihilistic. So the big change is not so much the numbers, but the type of person who's being attracted to a religion.
That's interesting. Now, so you would argue it's not a revival where there's massive numbers now following into some sort of faith. You're saying you don't believe that's the case.
Well, the data is pretty, you know, pretty clear that what I think has happened is the decline of religion this is from Pew, who I think does great work. The decline of religion has stopped, so that's a positive. But that the real numbers are not. There's no huge surge of people joining religion overall. I think part of what we see, Becky and I researched this, is I think that a lot of poorer people are sort of moving away from religion. So the idea of the sort of poor population that looks to religion because they don't know any better. That's less of the case. It's really those who actually, in a sense, know better. And one of the things that we're doing, this is in relation to Chapman, we're doing a conference on the rise of religious sentiment among scientists, which is never thought would ever happen.
And why do you think that's happening, Joel?
Well, I think the science. This is again, I'm just reflecting what the scientists themselves tell me. I mean, one of my close friends is an astrophysicist, um, and basically, what they're seeing in the universe is something that is not necessarily something that can be explained simply by scientific method. That, in other words, there must be some larger thing going on. Biologists have the same thing. The fact that we keep being surprised by things makes people think, well, maybe the world is not as instantly knowable or systematically knowable the way we think. So I have in this conference we're doing, we're bringing people from the Hindu background, Muslim backgrounds, um, from certainly Catholics, evangelicals, Jewish. I mean, my own rabbi is a convert who was an engineer, and so I think there's really something happening. Really interesting is the fact that there's been even a revival in Silicon Valley, where the Catholic Church in Santa Clara is one of the most heavily attended Catholic churches in the state. So something is happening. People are reaching a point where they realize that the sort of nihilistic worldview, the purely materialistic worldview, is actually counterproductive, and they're looking for something else.
Now, there was a very interesting article, one of the newspapers I read, about the surge of Catholicism
Yes.
in uh, in New York City, in particular. It described young people as going, they go to church and they go all have pizza together, and maybe they go and just sort of hang out together. I know that at Ohio State, the Catholic Church, the Newman Center Church, is filled there. I'm going to get a report as to what exactly is happening. I know that last year or 2 years ago, the Ohio State football team, they were very much together through faith. So when you look at younger people, what have you seen happening there?
Well, I think it's a reflective of this earlier and broader phenomena, which is people in college, as opposed to the person who drops out of high school, are the ones who are getting involved. My colleague here at Civitas was just telling me how busy the Catholic Church is right here on the University of Texas campus. Um, I remember this is something that I think is happening in lots of schools. I remember being here, during Ash Wednesday, and you see all these kids with the ashes on them, and obviously, I think there's also somewhat of a revival in some of the other Greek Orthodox is another group that seems to be attracting people. Um, One of the things that we're finding is that the more religiously attuned Jews do better in many cases, than those who have lost, because there's, the reasons for success. You can go back to Weber, you can go back to Calvin and the elect. you know, there's something about the religious discipline that seems to make people do better. And, I've been trying to understand this in Hinduism as well, that there's idea that in in Hindu scriptures, they're actually mathematical formulas. I mean, so I think that for most of history, most scientists and most people of letters were themselves very religious. They were religious in many different ways. Then we went through this period of sort of this great atheistic revival, if you will, or surge that took place, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century. And that seems to have peaked. Um, you know, of course, history is hard to know, and so maybe we'll go back to it. But I think there's something very logical when people begin to realize that with all this enormous amount of information that we have and all the technology we have, and that society is getting worse, maybe something else is a solution than just more technology or more or more material goods. And I mean, I'm actually writing a book on that, so I'm sort of interested in it.
Uh, so Joel, why do you think, and I know you're kind of touching on it, but when you say that people who are kind of approaching faith as more important do better than people who don't.
Yes.
So you are studying that. What do you
Yeah.
find? I mean, part of it is discipline, but what is it? Is it taught you?
Well,
You give me the answer.
well, I think there's certainly discipline. You don't do this, you don't do that. And it has many different forms. In the LDS Church, which I have a lot of context there. There are rules that, so you have less drunkenness or less divorce. Certainly, the idea of keeping the family together is an enormous boost. We see that. One of the really interesting things we also found is, and I think AEI has done some of this research, is that people who are religious tend to be have more friends. I mean, one of the great problems we have in society today is the amount of loneliness, not just among young people. And if you're part of a community of people who you share values with, I mean, I can say I see it, regularly in my own synagogue where, particularly older people, very often their significant others passed away, their kids have maybe moved away, that the synagogue community is something they go back to. A lot of our social interactions are from the synagogue community. We're not, I wouldn't call us particularly religious. My youngest daughter is, but I think it's that community. It's the community that people feel, no matter what their religious group. If my friends who are Sikhs, that's also an important part of their life. And I think as society has become more and more um, sort of disintegrated and more atomized, if you want to put it, that people are individuals with no connections. The need for those connections is greater and greater. And joining a church or a synagogue or a mosque, whatever it is, doing those things is far more uh, efficacious in terms of improving your human relations and providing human relations. Um, I mean, when you think about when a loved one dies, it's going to be that community that's going to, not just your family, but that community that will come to your aid. So I think that there are lots of practical reasons for this. And I think that we've sort of played out the extreme sort of atheistic and atomized era. I think it's getting to a point where, like I've in the book I'm writing now, one of the things I say, politics is not the solution. I know that's hard for maybe somebody who was a politician to believe, but the solutions are at the local level, they're at the family level, they're at the community level. You can't have a good country if you have people who are dysfunctional. That you're never going to get a good result, whether it's on the right or the left. So that the fundamental issues are those that have to be dealt with at that level. And religion is enormous. And they just one quick other thing is on the issue of education. I've visited Catholic affiliated schools in the South Bronx where kids are actually they wear uniforms, they're getting a good education. I was in one in Houston, an Greek Orthodox school where it's in Sharpstown, which is a pretty rough area. And those kids have to be fluent in either um, uh, Latin, Greek, or Arabic by the fifth grade. I think that is a enormous achievement, and I think that at the same time, whereas the public school system, particularly in very blue states, has just become an basically agitprop, for progressives. I think that this is something much better. And by the way, these church people are not necessarily conservative, but they do believe in basic Christian values, which they pass on, and also with some of the traditions of the Jesuits to, the joy of learning and about things as being important. And the kids get it. I mean, it's inspiring.
Well, Joel, first of all, I'd commend to you one of our great books called Heaven Help Us. It's a book I wrote about the
Uh,
power of local communities, but
all right.
you might
I'll,
find it very interesting, but I would hope so. But your argument, though, is what's interesting in all this is that you kind of look at religion as a social and sort of a civilizational force. You don't kind of look at it as somebody being inspired by something sort of greater.
well,
Now, let's just take some of these things you were talking about, which is the kids wearing the ashes on their forehead or restraining themselves in multiple ways, whether it's, drunkenness or whatever it is, how you treat your neighbor, whatever. When you say that, why do you think they do that? What is it? Is it just because they're part of an organization? I mean, if we think about Alcoholics Anonymous, I'm not an expert in the 12 steps, but that's conceding to a higher power, is what AA has been, right? So
yes.
the linchpin of all this, you kind of don't look at as a true journey into faith and a connection with the higher power. You look at it as sort of an economic or a social force. But do
Well,
I have that wrong?
well, I mean, personally, I wouldn't consider myself a very, um, as somebody driven by faith. That's just not who I am. Um, my younger daughter is,
So
but
what is she driven by that you're not?
the Torah,
Yeah.
and going through all the steps. I mean, I do some,
Yeah.
and my wife is much more involved in the synagogue part. Her mother's a survivor from the Second World War, so that has a lot of meaning. But Judaism is a very unique religion, and you could be very Jewish and not even be a believer in the higher power. Um, but that doesn't mean that other people don't see that. There's no question that this idea that there is a higher power, or I would even say, in my experience, knowing right from wrong, what is good, what is bad, um, what are your obligations to your parents, to your grandparents? What are the obligations of a parent to their children? Those are very deeply entrenched in all the religious traditions. And in those areas, I feel I'm pretty strong. I wish I had the faith of some of my friends who
But where do you think those came from, Joel? I mean,
those.
where did these ideas of family and strength and discipline, where do you think that comes from? I mean, it's passed down obviously from family to family, but where was the origin of it?
Well, I think it depends on where in the world. If you take China, those were from the scholarship of Confucius, and it was not predominantly a spiritual connection. Um, in the case of Christianity, I think there is a much stronger um, if you're not a believer, it's very hard to be a Christian, as we're certainly seeing with the mainstream Protestant churches, which are basically going out of existence. Whereas those churches where people believe are important. I mean, I guess I I come from that old Jewish tradition of scholarship and wanting to learn things. That's just natural to me, and I think it's important to understand things that work for other people, even if they're not that present for you. My job as a scholar, if you will, is to try to understand things. I'm not going to preach to anybody about these things. I'm going to say,
No,
"Look, these are things that work," and there's no question that religious revelation was a major factor, certainly in the Torah and in the New Testament,
right.
and in the Quran as well. More than anything else, I think it's this connection to old ideas, to the past, to humanity's evolution, that matters. And I think this, when I part of what I'm writing about in the book is when I look at the things that some of the tech oligarchs people believe in. It scares the bejeebies out of me. It makes me
Right.
absolutely, I was on a panel with the chief scientist of Google, and his vision of the world was so ugly to me that I can't even, I don't think we want to do this. One of my biggest theses is we're headed down this very dark tunnel, and if we don't go away from it, we're not going to stop it. And I'm going to try to say something that stops it, and try to say it in a way so I can reach all sorts of people, religious, non-religious, of any group. Because when you look at the world that's being projected now by this, by particularly by the tech people, I don't think it's a world that we want to live in.
Yeah. At the same time, as you said, we're starting to see the rise of religion in places like the Silicon Valley. Um, and, it's interesting because when you talk about the scientists, the biologists who are now believing more and more that there must be a higher power
Yeah.
that created it, it's deeper than just custom or habit. It's them finding something. And then when we say, Joel, I think that, well, we just need to follow our conscience. Well, let me see how you respond to this. Yeah, we follow our conscience in a world where we are bombarded with data and memes and posts, and all of a sudden, your conscience is not sort of in line with the compass that you might get from your faith, correct? I mean, it could become situational. So the idea that there's a higher power that we need to respond to creates a set of values and restraints that may not otherwise exist without the sense of transcendence. Does that make
Well,
sense?
yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think Einstein um, had it right. God doesn't play games with the universe. I
Yeah,
mean, there's, when I talk to people who are on the cutting edge of biology and the cutting edge of astrophysics, and
right.
they are telling me what it's done. I mean, there's a wonderful woman who is in the Catholic Scientist Group, that runs the biomedical labs at UC Irvine. Her conversion. I mean, she was brought up in I think as a Catholic. I'm not sure exactly, but she saw that, she said the way biology works, it makes you be in awe of something else,
Yeah,
and so. I think that these changes among the scientists, I think the fact that so many of our leading younger intellectuals are going, let's say, back to the Catholic Church or going to the Greek Orthodox Church is a sign. History it goes in cycles, and I think we may be at the end of this extraordinarily secular cycle,
right. Maybe. Yeah.
and
Yeah, Joel, that could be right. We could be at the end of a. But don't you think it's also that materialism leaves mankind wanting? In other words, these young people, may have come from families that are very successful, wealthy, and in some respects not very wealthy at all. A brokenness, a lack
yeah,
of meaning, and that these young people may be saying that doesn't work for me, that I really want to know what the meaning of life is, to quote Viktor Frankl, by the way.
mhm.
And what a book that is, right? About personal faith and growth and discipline and hope. Uh, it's pretty wonderful. Do you think that could be part of what explains these young people? They're
Uh,
really searching for something that has real meaning.
yeah, I think that's true. And what's interesting is, again, I just spent a month in Rome, and I've been reading a lot of the early accounts, particularly of Christianity, and many of the people who converted at great cost to themselves were themselves from very wealthy families. They had it made. They were
Yeah,
living in the center of the greatest empire ever, and they felt that need to change. And I think this goes by throughout all history. What Buddha was a prince. Um, you know, I think that I think there's something going on in this society. I'm trying to define it, that people realize that this path we're on, this purely materialistic path, which is, by the way, in both political parties, one, that this isn't going to be, this is these problems are not going to be solved by just rational means. There has to be some belief system in that, to make it work.
Responsibility. Yeah.
And I think, you go back to almost any of the great thinkers, they all would ascribe to this. And I think my hope is that I'm going to try to understand, is there a way, without rejecting technology, which is incredibly important, but is there a way to build a better society using technology as a tool as opposed to being used as a tool by technology?
Yeah. That's a very interesting, and that gets down to motivation of the technologists.
Right.
And when I look at the CEO of Anthropic, as opposed um, to the other AI development, Sam Altman's company, the Anthropic guy said, "Look, you can't pay me enough money to turn my technology over to a Pentagon that could use my technology either to spy on human beings or to be used as an autonomous system in warfare." And the Anthropic CEO, Dario, I can't remember his last name, to me, he's a terrific guy because he's saying, yes, we have this wonderful technology, but it needs to be harnessed. It needs to be restrained. And I would love to interview him to see what his motivation was, Joel. And I think his motivation is, I don't know. I would suspect it could be fundamentally faith-based, but I think you and I would both agree on the fact that this rise of religion in the proper way, is a positive for our society.
Oh, I think it's absolutely critical if we're not going to go down this path that is clear before, when you read things like the singularity, or you
Yeah.
listen to how these people look at the world. I say, I don't want to hand the future that my children are growing up in to these people, because they have no real human values at all.
Um, it just this whole thing of the meaning of life, and you were talking about being religious. I mean, for those that study, um, I wouldn't say I'm a great student, but I'm in the book of Ezekiel. I mean, you want to know what tough is, you read that book. But one of my daughters, twin girls, one of them sent me a little interview that a man did, or a little talk a man did, where he was saying that in order to enter paradise, it's not about I did this, I was that, I was the other thing. Uh, the man goes on to say it's about him. It's about, as a Christian, it's about our Savior. And and he was saying, well, the question is who gets in? And the funny thing is, he was saying in this, and we've all laughed about it, is remember there's two guys hanging on the cross next to Jesus.
Right.
And the one man hanging on the cross gets in. And the angel's up in heaven and he says, how'd you get in here? He says, well, the guy in the middle hanging on the cross, he told me I could come. And and the angel says, well, you never studied this book and you never did this thing or that thing. But there's something about when people talk about religion, we love when people go to church, we love when they study, blah, blah, blah. But it's not about that, right? It's about an attitude and your heart vis-a-vis that person or that being that you view as your creator. Whether you're a Jew, whether you're a Christian, that was the message. I thought it was pretty powerful.
Well, I think it's very powerful. No, but I hope, and having just spent a month in Italy, that somehow that spark returns to European civilization. Because
Oh,
without it,
yeah. Yeah.
it's. I mean, I did see. We were there right around Easter. We did see some large congregations with some young people, so maybe something positive is happening.
Oh yeah. Joel, how let's conclude with this reflection on your part, critical right now. How was the veal and how was the pasta?
The food in Italy is amazing, and I'm actually working on a project for the Italian Institute about what they could learn from us and what we can learn from them. And one thing is for sure, the fact that they have these nice regional farming areas around the cities, the quality of the ingredients is so much greater. The relationship between the product and the seller is so much greater. And one of the questions we're having is, can we do this without, or will just work for the very wealthy? And that's one of the issues that
That's right because when they try to eat healthier, it seems as though it costs more, but maybe AI will help us with that.
we're
Who knows? Joel, good to talk to you.
nice
We
to
might
talk to
have to
you.
do another one because I think you're kind of discovering things, and I think it's very interesting what you're finding. My conclusion is, if you wonder about this, dig in, dig in, and see what you can find. So thank you, sir, so much for joining today.
Well, thank you, and I
Okay,
look forward to coming back.
thank you.